Welcome to the Law School Insider, where we have conversations with students, lawyers, and employers.
Succeeding in law school is something that you must prepare for, not only before you begin, but throughout your law school journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. I am your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I will draw from my over 20 years of experience in the college admission field, as well as bring forth the experiences of others as we delve deeper into the issues. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Law School Insider. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis. I'm so excited to have you back again this week. And this week we're doing something a little bit different. Usually we talk about some specific topics about law school success, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But outside of that, though, we're going to delve into some popular culture, because one of the new television shows that is out there today is Designated Survivor, which has a lot of ramifications with the law, especially constitutional law. And I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into that because I've been watching it personally and had kind of an interest in looking at the reality of this concept, but also to look at television itself, because I know a lot of you may look at the law, maybe even your first introduction to a lawyer might be what you see on TV. And we're going to delve a little bit into what is the reality of law on television, and is what you're going to see on television going to be what you're going to be doing when you get into the profession. So today, we're lucky to be able to have Professor of Law Devin Schindler, who is a constitutional law expert at Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, joining us today. And he's going to be sharing some perspectives. So Professor Schindler, thanks so much for joining us this week.
Well, it's a tremendous pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you, Dr. Lewis, about a fascinating topic, which is getting a fair amount of play now as a result of the show you mentioned.
It really is. And, I think some of it goes into the drama of it, as well as the kind of the intrigue. But I think a lot of people don't always know the Constitution to the fullest extent. And when this idea comes out, they say, oh, that must be what really happens. So let's talk first about some of the reality in this constitutional piece of succession lining, and how much reality are you seeing on the show versus how much, let's say, latitude has the show been taking?
Well, the founders were sensitive to the issue of what happens if the president or vice president should die, or something terrible should happen to both of them, either individually or at the same time. And of course, when the Constitution was embodied, people lived much shorter lives, and without the medical help that we have today, without the medical profession that we have today, it was a challenge that you could lose a president at any time, either through disaster or through a medical issue. And so in the Constitution, they specifically put in a provision, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6, for those of you keeping track at home, that basically said, yes, the president is the leader or the head of the executive branch. All executive power vests with the president. But should the president die or become disabled, the vice president would step up. So as a matter of the Constitution, there's really only two people in the line of succession, the president and then the vice president. But the founders did recognize that something really terrible could happen, and we could potentially lose both, or both could become disabled. And so the Constitution gives Congress the authority to pass laws involving or essentially setting a list for presidential succession. And not surprisingly, one of the first laws in 1792 that the Congress enacted and the president signed, in that case George Washington signed, was to create a line of presidential succession. Now, the first line is not all that different than the current line of presidential succession. The first line in the 1792 Act, the president pro temp of the Senate, which is essentially the oldest senator in the majority party, mostly a ceremonial post, but he will sit and lead the Senate when the VP is not available. The vice president is not available to do so, was first in line, and then the Speaker of the House was second in line. Well, that's where we were at for a number of years, but then in 1886, a number of questions on separation of powers came afoot, and the question of whether or not we could really have congressmen in the line of succession. And so a new law was passed, which made it the president, the vice president, and then went down the list of the cabinet officers to determine who was next in line. Well, that situation was in place until 1947, when Harry Truman said, I'm not so certain it's a great idea to have the cabinet members, in case something should happen at the White House, the only people in line. And, by the way, who elected cabinet members? Well, nobody. They're appointed. And so at the recommendation of President Truman, the law was amended yet again to put the President pro temp and the Speaker of the House back in the list. Now, this time they flipped it. They put the Speaker of House, Nixon, the list behind the Vice President, and then the President of the Senate pro temp fourth in line. So what we've seen over the last, 240 years is we've always sort of had a list, but the list has changed over time on who gets to be the president. God forbid something terrible should happen to the vice president or the president at the same time.
Now, is there any possibility that a person so far down, such as what we're seeing on television in housing and urban development, could actually then become president in this setup?
Well, and in fact, the list is rather long. There are 17 people currently on the list. And of course, to be on the list, you have to meet all the requirements of Article 2, which means you must be a natural-born citizen, whatever that means. You need to be 35 years old and have been a U.S. resident for at least 14 years. And so we do have 17 people on the list, but from time to time there may be a cabinet official or even the Speaker of the House potentially that does not meet the presidential requirements because perhaps they were born as a foreign citizen, a naturalized citizen. And so currently, for example, the Secretary of Interior, who would otherwise be eighth on the list, is no longer on the list because she was not a natural-born citizen. Now, having said that, what we've done in the last number of years, as a matter of fact, most recently in 2016, is in 2016, for example, during the State of the Union address, the President pro temp and the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security is number 17 on the list, the current list. Both were the so-called designated survivors. Neither showed up for the State of the Union address, and they were taken to secret locations, apparently far away from Washington, D.C., should something happen in Washington, D.C., to make sure that they were available should, again, God forbid, some sort of disaster would happen. So the short answer is, yeah, you could easily have somebody pretty far down on the list, but more recently, the President of the Senate pro temp has also sat out, and he or she is number 3 on the list. Long way of saying, who knows, Dr. Lewis? Yes, it is conceivable that you could have somebody pretty far down the list be the designated survivor for any particular State of the Union address or any other activity where a large number of the cabinet and the president are present.
Very fascinating because, you look at this and you say to yourself, could this really happen? So I'm really appreciative that you have kind of illuminated all of us about the reality of the situation that our Constitution has set up and that our forefathers have set up. This really opens up my own eyes to some of the legal ramifications and legal issues that you see on television today. Because I speak to students all the time that have said to me that they've first learned about the law or they've first seen a lawyer from what they see on TV. They watch Law and Order, or they saw Perry Mason, or whatever it might be. But I know that sometimes the reality of what you see on TV and what you do in the profession may not be accurate. What have you seen?
Well, it's interesting you should mention Perry Mason because I was raised on Perry Mason. I think I'm showing my age here, Dr. Lewis. I was raised on Perry Mason and Anatomy of a Murder and movies like that, which showed the law generally as being a respected profession, a profession where intelligent people did good things for our community and our society. And whether it might be a question of our society, the level of crassness, for lack of a better term, or this reflects a larger societal movement. More recently, we're seeing lawyers in TV shows like L.A. Law, which was 20, 30 years ago, who were not necessarily the most ethical. And even more recently, we have TV shows like Better Call Saul, where we have an attorney who would last about 6 months in the Michigan bar because of his unethical conduct. So we have seen, in my mind, a transition. Occasionally, a favorable legal character shows up. I will grant you that. But I am hoping and praying that students out there or prospective law students are not taking their message from what I see in a lot of current legal shows, Boston Legal and things of that nature. Now, having said that, there are still some favorable legal characters that are shown, but certainly not as many Perry Masons as there used to be. So my first concern with anybody watching a legal show is that they understand that it's been highly dramatized. And second, that the character they are watching probably does not, at least not in all cases, reflect what the practice of law is truly about. It is an honored profession. We have ethical rules that the vast majority of lawyers follow. For every Better Call Saul, there is 1,000 lawyers that do their best to follow the ethical precepts of our profession. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that, television, being a one-hour show medium, really cannot get into the subtleties of what we do day in and day out. They cut right to the trial, which happens within days of the arrest. Well, that's not true either. Obviously there's motion practice and things that go on that a dramatization can't reflect. So there's lots of great, exciting moments when you're practicing law, but let's be candid. There are times where you just have to slog through 1,000 documents to figure out what is the best argument for you to make for your client. And, of course, none of that does not dramatize well in an hour television show. So it's a combination of those two things. The fact that so many lawyer characters we see on television do not reflect the traditions of our honored profession, and the dramatization that I think can sometimes give an unrealistic or even unfair reflection of what it means to be a lawyer. So I would say to the potential lawyers out there, the potential law students out there, watch these shows for entertainment, but watch them with a jaded eye, recognizing that what you're seeing hopefully does not reflect the honor of our profession, nor the hard work that it takes to not only be a good lawyer, but to be a good law student too.
Great advice, and I think that's definitely something that everyone should be looking at. Now, if someone really wanted to watch Law and Order, where you said that the lawyers there may not be doing the most ethical things, they may not be seeing the law in exactly the way that they're going to be seeing it when they're actually studying it. What are some things that they should be looking at to learn from as they are watching it with that critical eye?
You can learn as much, I suppose, from good mentors as bad examples. And ask yourself, when a lawyer is doing something, Better Call Saul or one of these television programs, ask yourself, would you do that? Is that consistent with your ethical internal virtue? And if the answer is, yeah, I would do that, well, for some of these situations that we see in these dramatizations, then maybe you don't belong in the law profession, because ultimately the law profession only works if people respect it, and that requires not only highly trained, competent lawyers, it requires virtuous lawyers. And so finding your own internal compass is so important to be a good lawyer. And at some level, some of these shows will show you, how not to do it. And so one thing we can learn as we watch these programs is we can test our own internal compass, our own sense of virtue, as to whether or not this is something we would be willing to do. The flip side is true, too. Occasionally you see these programs where ethical lawyers take on clients that are just not very nice people. Part of being a lawyer is, particularly if you're in a criminal defense practice, is that you're going to be representing people that are not very nice. But you still have an ethical obligation to represent them zealously. That is how our system works. And so in some of these shows, at least, you can get a flavor. The kind of people, particularly if you're going to be in the criminal defense practice, but even otherwise, the kind of people that are not virtuous, can you maintain your virtue when you represent really the outsiders to our society, our community? Are you willing to represent people that engage in speech with which you disagree, Nazis, people like that? Well, that's unfortunately or fortunately, depending how you look at it, that's the role of a lawyer, to defend the Constitution. So the bottom line to your question, Dr. Lewis, and it is a good one, is these shows can give you an internal compass to check your own sense of virtue, as well as challenge you. Is this the kind of person I'd be willing to represent, and would I be willing to represent them zealously?
I want to transition a little bit into law school, outside of what you see on television, and talk about that internal compass, because as you go through law school, I know there's going to be times where that internal compass, that moral fiber that you have, may be challenged. And as a professor of law, are there things that you might say to a student if someone came to you and said, I'm struggling with this? What are some things that they can be doing as they're going through law school to deal with some of those ethical dilemmas, moral dilemmas, questions that may kind of shake the fabric of who they are, that you might